2 summers ago, I worked as a camp counselor. The camp was very far up north in a sparsely populated region and was sort of hidden away in a forested valley area. Each week, groups of kids from organizations similar to the Scouts would come up and participate in different activities. My job was to oversee a certain cabin of kids. The week this story takes place, I had a decent cabin group. The kids weren't too annoying, and they mostly listened to me and got along with each other. Each cabin, every Friday night, was required to participate in a night game that was a competition against the other cabins. The game worked essentially as one giant game of capture the flag in the woods, except each cabin had their own flag and the other groups didn't know exactly where it was located. While the kids played the game, it was basically each counselor's job to follow them as they ran around and act as a referee. During the game, I was overseeing our cabin flag mostly. I hadn't seen or heard anyone nearby in a while, so I started walking through the woods in the direction of the nearest cabin's flag to check up on things. It was dark out there, like the unsettling kind of dark that plays tricks on your eyes, and you start seeing shadows, and every sound makes you pause and listen. As I was walking, I swear I saw a shadow that was my size run past me. I couldn't see it very well, and nothing was there when I turned my flashlight on, so I just assumed I was imagining things. I heard the victory chant of one of the other cabin groups in the distance, meaning the game had ended. And that's when I saw the shadow again. It was standing by a tree not too far away from me. I thought it was one of the other cabin leaders hiding, so I turned my flashlight on and started walking over there. As I got closer, I could see it was definitely a person standing there, but I stopped when I realized it didn't look like another leader. They were wearing dark clothes and a sack over their head, covered in what looked like multiple plastic bags tied together. I got this feeling of just pure dread and had to turn my flashlight off because I was uncomfortable. After a couple seconds of standing in the dark, I told myself to stop being a sissy and decide to ask if everything was alright. I got no response. The only thing I heard was this weird sound that sounded like thumps on something wooden. Nevertheless, I crept a little closer until I was about 10 meters away from this person. The sound turned out to be that person smacking his head repeatedly into the tree. He was barefoot and his clothes were caked with crusted mud. I was trying to convince myself that this was another one of the leaders pulling a prank. Scare pranks were not uncommon by any means at camp, so I told them to knock it off. The person stopped as soon as I said that, slowly turned to face me, and began approaching me as if they were power walking. The speed at which he was approaching me alarmed me, so I ran. It didn't matter if it was just a stupid prank and I ran away scared for nothing. If this wasn't a prank, it felt like I was in serious danger, so I ran as fast as I could. I heard him running after me, but I didn't want to turn around and look, as I'd probably run into a tree. I arrived back to the starting point, which was a gravel clearing in front of the dining hall, and everyone who could have been dressed like that was already there. There's no way they could have gone back before me. And if they did, they sure as hell didn't have the time to change into their regular clothes. Still, I told them, and that they gave me a good scare with that. They just looked at me weird, thinking I was trying to scare them, and we left it at that. The next morning, I wanted to go check it out. Who knows, maybe some weirdo ate the wrong mushroom and might be out there dying from hypothermia. I took someone with me just in case. There was nothing but endless trees. We arrived at the tree where I saw the person banging his head, and there was a dead, skinned, decomposing rabbit nailed to the tree. We called the cops, and they looked around quickly and just brushed it off. This happened to me about 5 months ago at this point, during the summer when I was working as a camp counselor at a camp in rural northern Utah. At the end of each week, when the campers would leave before the next group of campers would arrive, we would hold a closing ceremony and campfire for them. On one such closing campfire, after we had finished cleaning up and all the campers had left, me and my two buddies who were on staff, Peter and Andrew, decided to walk back the long way through an old gravel road alongside the lake to the staff camp. We did it purely for shits and giggles because it might be kind of creepy since there was a full moon out. At some point during the walk, probably when we were halfway around the lake, we moved from the gravel road onto a narrow trail through the woods that was a shortcut towards the staff camp that ran directly alongside the lake. We had been chatting pretty loudly, and while there was a break in our conversation at one point, we all heard a distinct splash coming from the water next to us that made us all freeze. It didn't sound like a fish. It sounded more intentional, like a splash made from a large object, like a rock being thrown into the water or something like that. We all looked at each other, laughed, and just kept walking, continuing our conversation. Just when I was starting to forget about it, we all heard it again. A loud, deliberate splash coming from the adjacent water. This time it was so loud it stopped us from talking mid-conversation, as we could all hear it clearly over our voices. Peter and Andrew laughed, as did I, but I definitely found it more freaky than I would have admitted at the time. Andrew asked what we thought it was, and I replied it couldn't have been a fish unless the fish was following us. They both laughed when I said this, which caused me to laugh. Then the sound of lapping water hitting the shore silenced us. Something was causing large ripples in the water. Peter pulled out his flashlight and aimed it towards the reeds next to us, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, as a figure seemed to be moving through the reeds towards us. It looked like some freakishly tall man. Peter is 6'4", and this person, or thing, whatever it was, appeared to have at least 3 inches on him. It seemed to be wearing black clothing or some type of hood because I couldn't make out any identifying features, like a face or anything like that. Then it started making this noise. The best I can describe it is it sounded like some sort of raspy, moaning drone type noise. It was very low and guttural, but it was getting louder as it was making its way through the reeds straight towards us. Finally, Andrew screaming to run for it was what brought me back to my senses, and I started running while glancing over my shoulder. I watched as Andrew and Peter quickly followed me, and I couldn't tell if the thing was following us after that because I had to keep my eyes on the trail to prevent myself from falling. We made it back to staff camp safely. We tried telling a few of the other staff about it, but none of them believed us, which I can understand as to why. I don't know how I would react to a different person telling me they saw something coming towards them from the lake. And I keep saying thing because I'm really not sure at all if that was a person or not. The sound it made almost didn't sound human, but it looked humanoid. And like I said, I couldn't make out a face or anything coming towards us. What disturbs me the most about the whole incident is the fact that that thing must have been stalking us, because the second time we heard the splash, we were a good half-mile away from where we had heard the initial splash in the water. When I was 12 years old, my parents sent me to my first sleepaway camp. I wasn't the most outgoing kid, so I was pretty nervous. Therefore, my mom managed to pull a couple strings and set me up in a cabin with my friend Tom, who was also going. There were about 30 other kids at the camp, all between probably 10 and 14 years old, with 7 camp workers who were all in their 20s. We were staying in groups of 4 in a relatively big house. By the second day, most of my nerves were calmed when me and Tom realized the other kids in our cabin were actually pretty cool. If I remember correctly, their names were Darren and Christian. Christian was the only one in our group who wasn't 12. He was 13, so obviously he automatically assumed control over us. At the time, I probably thought he was the coolest kid ever, but looking back now, he was definitely trouble. The second night of camp, we were all staying up late in the big cabin, just taking turns on Christian's Nintendo DS. He had snuck that, along with a bunch of candy, into the cabin, which none of us were supposed to have. The windows were all open, as there was no AC in the cabin and we had to open them or else we'd fry in there with it being the middle of the summer. I began to hear someone walking through the leaves outside the cabin. I thought for sure it was a camp worker, so I told them to hide the DS. Christian threw it under his pillow and we all jumped into bed, pretending to be asleep. The footsteps came up the stairs and onto the deck. Then it sounded like they paced back and forth in front of the cabin door. This went on for a good 2 minutes before the footsteps went back down the stairs. I listened to them as they faded off towards the woods. That was odd, as I didn't understand why they would be walking out into the woods as opposed towards the other cabins. Ours was the last in the row of cabins bordering the woods. We went back to playing on the DS and nothing else weird happened that night. The next night, we were once again staying up past curfew to play on Christian's DS. And once again, we all heard the footsteps in the leaves outside approaching the cabin. I jumped into bed as they repeated their routine of going up the stairs and stopping in front of the door for a couple minutes, and then going back down the steps and heading around the left side of the cabin towards the woods. Once again, Christian got out the DS after we were sure whoever it was gone, but this time we were all too freaked out to continue playing. We whispered, trying to decide if it was a worker or not, and if they knew that we were still awake. Christian seemed convinced, or at least seemed like he was trying to convince himself, that it was a kid from a different cabin trying to scare us. The cabins really weren't spaced that far apart, and they all had their windows open, so it was a possibility for other cabins to know that we were still awake. Darren had to use the bathroom after that. Tom and I told him not to go, but Christian volunteered to go with him. Not long after, they came back looking freaked out. They told us to come take a look at something. We followed them outside to a low-hanging branch near the side of the cabin that was covered in what looked like strands of long black hair. We started semi-panicking as the idea of a bear or some other predatory animal stalking us was tossed around. We all calmed down a bit after we agreed to go back inside and close all the windows. I didn't get much sleep that night, needless to say. We didn't stay up late the next night or the night after that, and none of us, as far as I know, woke up and heard the footsteps. Thursday night, the second to last night of camp, came. That night, Christian wanted to stay up late again. I didn't want to, and I honestly don't think Tom wanted to either. But with Darren being Christian's yes man and Tom eventually agreeing, of course I had to agree as well. The thought of those footsteps returning was on my mind the whole time we played on the DS, and eventually, with all the windows open, we heard them outside again. Like clockwork, we all jumped into bed and listened as they came up the steps and stopped by the door. But this time, they continued walking down the right side of the deck. The first bunk on the right side of the cabin was left empty. Then there was the window, and then there was me and Tom's bunk, with me on the top and Tom under me. I flipped to my side to face Christian and Darren on the other side of the cabin, terrified as I knew this person was about to walk past the open window. The footsteps came right up to the window and stopped. All was silent for about 20 seconds. I almost turned my head to look when the sound of Tom's blood-curdling scream rang out, sending a shockwave through my whole body. Instantly, I saw him running for the door and screaming, so I jumped down and ran after him. I heard Christian and Darren behind me. Without looking back, we all ran towards the camp offices. By the time we got there, a bunch of workers were already coming outside. Tom was crying and saying something was looking in our cabin window. A couple of workers went down to the cabin to look for whoever it was, and then a couple of them stayed with us. A bunch of the kids from the other cabins were also waking up and coming outside, but they were all told to go back to sleep by their respective counselors. I will never forget what Tom said in front of us and those adults. He said he saw someone peeking in the top right corner of the window, and they quickly shifted from his view. He said all he saw was an eye, ghostly pale skin, and long black hair hanging over the window. What disturbs me the most is the fact that if this person or thing was looking in at him from the top right corner of the window, it had to be either freakishly tall, standing on something, or floating. Even at that age, I could tell the camp personnel wasn't really sure what to do about this. The next morning, they had Tom's parents come and pick him up early. I'm still friends with Tom today, and what he saw really hit him hard. He had trouble sleeping for months after that and had to be prescribed sleeping medicine, and was suffering from horrible nightmares from what I could gather. He's fine now. I never saw those kids, Darren and Christian, again, but I'm sure they haven't forgotten this either.